Hello, and welcome to our lecture concerning Russian politics. This week, you kind of get a special bargain, right? Instead of just doing Russia, we're also going to be looking at the Soviet Union as well, right? In order to understand how modern Russia functions, which, in a bit of a spoiler, is actually the way it functioned right before the communists came in. We have to understand what the communists did, right, and how the Soviet Union itself functioned. So Russia is another one of those countries with a very long history, but we can really pinpoint a good place to start by going back to the time of Peter the Great, right? So Peter the Great was one of the major early imperial leaders of Russia. And what he served to do was to expand Russia contiguously to the west and across the ocean and into Alaska a bit. So we're talking around the early 1700s, late 1600s here. Right? So prior to this point in time, Russia was essentially a landlocked country. Yes, they had a very large border to an ocean to the north, right, the Arctic Ocean. But the problem with that is that for the majority of the year, that coastline remained frozen. And Russia also had very poor agriculture for, again, climatological reasons. Even though it's a very large country, it also had a small population of about 14 million, and they were under a feudal system for a very long time. So Russia was essentially landlocked and had very poor agriculture under Peter the Great. But Peter the Great decided that he wanted to make Russia more European. Right? So he moves the capital of Russia to a new city he built far in the west, called St. Petersburg. Right? And this was considered to be the Paris of Russia. Right? It was a very beautiful, well-designed city. So he started off this tradition of making Russia much more Western. About 50 years later, Catherine the Great comes along and fights off the Ottomans, who attempted to come in from the south. And after she defeated the Ottomans, she began to push her empire towards the south, taking over parts of Russia like Georgia, Chechnya, right? A lot of parts of Russia to the south. Catherine the Great is considered, again, to be one of the best and most powerful figures in Russian history. So this gets us into the 1800s, where Emperor Alexander I made Russia into a very powerful, fearsome military power once he defeated Napoleon. Now, a large part of that defeat had to do with weather. Russia gets very cold in the winter. But also because he pushed for westernization. What we will see is that a lot of the well-thought-of political leaders in Russia, especially Imperial Russia, were pro-westernizing. Right? They wanted to westernize, make Russia a great Western European style power. And this is going to betray one of the central tensions we're going to see in Russian culture, is this tension between wanting to be Western and modern, and wanting to hold to their Slavic roots and their Slavic tradition, right? Proud of being Russian, not wanting to be Western. So at the end of the 1800s, we see Nicholas I, right, Tsar Nicholas I, come to power, and he is under assault from many different directions. Particularly is this group called the Decembrists. No, not the band, but a political group that attempted to put into place a constitutional monarchy. Now, in response to this, Nicholas I finally freed the serfs. Right, he got rid of the feudal system and translated the population of Russia from being serfs to being citizens. So Nicholas I did a lot of good things towards moving Russia into a modern country. Now, mind you, this is 200 years after the rest of the West had begun to do this. Now, Alex II followed on from Nicholas I, and he undid a lot of the modernizations that were done by Nicholas I. He was a very pro-Slavic leader. He allowed Russian military to backslide a lot. So that by the time the next leader comes around, Nicholas II, Russia ends up fighting a war with Japan, which they lose. He ends up fighting a World War I, which they lose as well. So the monarchy becomes very destabilized in Russia. At this point, Alexander Kerensky steps in to create a constitutional monarchy in Russia. Right, creates a parliament called the Duma, does all sorts of things to try to hold the country together. We're talking about 1917 here. So, meanwhile, in Paris, let's roll back the clock a little bit. We see a lot of political movements get started in Russia. A lot of political philosophy occur. Names like Mikhail Bakunin and Alexander Kropotkin, right, both socialists and anarchists, really get going in Russia. Right, there's a lot of political tension against the monarchy in Russia. So that ends up taking over one part of the ideological battle. But then we also have the emergence of different political groups that call themselves communist. And in 1903, there's a meeting in Paris where there's a showdown between two different groups of communists. There's, on the one hand, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, and on the other hand, the Mensheviks, led by, well, it doesn't really matter because they lost. The Mensheviks wanted to follow Marx's plan. They wanted to slowly develop Russia into a capitalist country so that eventually communism would be able to step in. On the other hand, Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks believed they were the vanguard of the proletariat, that they had to lead the proletariat from the front and show them the way towards a glorious communist future. So when World War I goes very poorly for Russia, this leaves a very large power vacuum. So Trotsky sneaks back into Russia and starts fomenting revolution against the Russian regime. Right, he basically kicks off a civil war. And then at the end of 1917, right in November, Lenin shows back up in Moscow. During this October Revolution, which took place in November due to calendar differences, they end up kicking out Alexander Kerensky. They kill the monarchs. They storm the palace. Right, the whole Princess Anastasia thing. They kill off everyone. They want a clean break from the past. So this leads to a civil war from about 1917 to 1921. And this was a period called War Communism, where there was actually a whole lot of freedom to do what you wanted to, right? Even though communism was officially put in place, there was a lot of experimentation about the best way to do communism until about 1921. Now, in 1921, the Constitutional Convention occurred because the Civil War was over. On the first day of the Constitutional Convention, Lenin wanted to take charge, right? He wanted to lead and be the vanguard of the proletariat. But this didn't go well. There were all these other political parties that also fought and won in the Civil War, so they kicked Lenin out. Now, on the second day, Lenin shows back up with all these guys with guns and essentially takes control, and that kind of shows how the rest of communist Russia is going to carry on. So Lenin, with his friends in the institution he created called the Cheka, led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, which were basically secret police, along with Antonin Molotov, who was the Minister of State, also the guy that invented the Molotov cocktail, and his friend Trotsky, right, his second in command, and their friend Joseph Stalin, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party. Right? He's the guy that just took the notes and knew who was a member here and there. He wasn't really a big mover and shaker until he became the general secretary of the Communist Party, and this will be important in just a little bit. By the way, the guy that's pictured on the right is young Joseph Stalin. Ladies, control yourselves. All right, so once Stalin comes to power, which was a major surprise to everyone, including Trotsky. Right, Trotsky was considered to be the second in command. He was going to be the guy who ran the country after Lenin died. Well, once Lenin died, Stalin used all of his knowledge of controlling who was a member of the Communist Party to put himself into power. Right, and he begins to consolidate power, kill off and purge all the people who opposed him, and then he sets up these 5-year plans to develop the country. So these 5-year plans go on from about 1925 until essentially the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. But Stalin was very interested in controlling his own country and expanding it. So along come the Germans at the beginning of World War II, where they decided to make an alliance to take over Poland, and everything was great. Until that is, of course, the Germans betrayed Stalin and invaded Russia. That's when the Soviet Union kicked off the Great Patriotic War and essentially beat the hell out of the Nazis. Now, after the war was over, Stalin began to fail in his health. So once he died, Nikita Khrushchev takes over, and he attempts to set up a regularized governance platform for the Soviet Union, as well as denouncing a lot of the things that Stalin did. He predicated all of his actions on a principle called democratic centralism. Now, this isn't what you would think it is. This is decision-making from the center, right, within what they called the Politburo, they were democratic. They were all equal. But the Politburo then dictated to the rest of the country what they were going to do. So they were democratic at the center, and then from the center, all of the actions and policies would come out. Khrushchev ends up engaging very heavily in the Cold War, opposing the Americans and starting the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev governs pretty well for about a decade. Now, after Khrushchev dies or retires, Brezhnev comes into power. Brezhnev was essentially a pretty corrupt ruler, worried about improving his own personal life, but the government, on the other hand, just pretty much carries on as it will. So Brezhnev governs for about 15 years, and the Cold War kind of cools down for a little while. Once Brezhnev dies, there's a very quick succession of old guard leaders, including Alexander Andropov and a couple of other guys. And what ends up happening is that they end up transitioning to a new generation of leadership, led by Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is the one who ends up becoming responsible for the transition from the Soviet Union to Russia and the end of communism. So part of the elements of this transition is that they put into place two practices called glasnost and perestroika. What this is an opening of both the political side of things, right, allowing more participation in politics, as well as opening up the economy. Now, this is a response to two major issues. The first is the war in Afghanistan, where the Soviets were heavily involved, and the United States funded the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet Union, to essentially bleed them in the way that we were bled during the Vietnam War. And then secondly, in 1986, the Chernobyl disaster occurred, and this was a huge confidence killer, a huge killer of confidence in the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union itself ended up on very shaky ground, especially after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So what ends up happening is the Soviet military attempts to retrench. They attempt to have a coup against the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is out at his dacha in the wilderness, right, at his retreat, and the military holds him there. No one knows if he's alive or dead. So what ends up happening is the military goes and starts attacking what's called the White House, the Russian governmental offices. And the only person that's there who's really strong enough to stand up to this military is a man named Boris Yeltsin, who you'll see on the right here in the picture. He's the guy in the suit with his hand clenched in a fist on top of a tank, where he literally went out and, while the military was firing at the White House, climbed aboard this tank and got the military to stop firing. So the military, he was able to stop the military from firing and was able to negotiate a transition, the release of Mikhail Gorbachev, and this really ended up moving towards ending the Soviet Union. Right? They ended the Soviet Union. They allowed the constituent states to go away, and the Soviet Union then transitioned to Russia, where they had democratic elections. So in 1992 and 1993, they elected in Boris Yeltsin, and they approved a new constitution that we'll talk about in a little bit. But they also had to undo a lot of the military dictatorship that came in under Russia, came in under the Soviet Union. And they had to undo economic dictatorship as well. So they attempted something called shock therapy. This was led by a guy named Igor Gaidar. Gaidar was actually a pretty radical dude. He met in secret and discussed radical books like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He discussed Mises, Hayek, Keynes, right? Things that are very standard here, but in the 1980s were very subversive in Russia. So shock therapy was essentially rapidly transitioning from command economy to capitalism. And this occurred by rapidly selling off the publicly held businesses in Russia. So what ends up happening is the only people that had the money to buy these businesses were the mafia. So the mafia ends up buying up a lot of Russia, and they end up becoming what are called the oligarchs, a very small, very rich ruling class. And this is going to be one of the major problems Russia has to deal with moving forward. So Yeltsin ends up having failing health. He has a couple of heart attacks during his second term of office, and just generally needs to transition out of leadership. So what he does is he goes and he picks his successor. He picks the person he's going to endorse, who is this little-known person named Vladimir Putin. Right, back in 2000, nobody knew who this guy was. It was a big surprise when he came to power. Obviously, Putin's the guy on the right. So once Putin comes to power, he ends up having to deal with several different issues. One, he has to deal with establishing rule of law and fighting the oligarchs. Second, he has to deal with a terrorist movement out of Chechnya, which he does very effectively. And finally, he has to help rebuild the economy, which he got lucky, and the oil industry really began to kick in the early 2000s in Russia. So modern Russia really loves its parties of power. It really loves to support people who are in power. So the major party that really gets elected a lot of times is something called United Russia, which is essentially the party meant to support those who are already in government. And you'll see why this is so important and why they get about 80% of the vote when you look at what the other political parties are. On the left, you have honest-to-God leftover communists, and nobody really wants to return to that. It may look appealing sometimes, but nobody really wants to get back to that. The center and the liberals, right, liberals in the sense that we use in this course, are almost non-existent within the country. So this leaves only one major opposition group called the Liberal Democrats, which are neither liberal nor democratic, and they're not really even a party. It's just a bunch of people that support this crazy nationalist guy named Vladimir Zhirinovsky. He wants to essentially restore Russia to good old fascist power, like they might have had during the golden years of the Soviet Union. So when that is your best political alternative, you clearly vote for Vladimir Putin, right? He's very popular. There is some evidence there might be some vote stealing going on there, but it's very unlikely that it's Putin who's pushing it. All right, if you look to the right here, we've got a nice little explanation of why people would support Vladimir Putin. Right, the GDP has increased hugely. People are much richer. There's much lower inflation. They have way less national debt, and incomes are way up. So this is a pretty good system. That leads to Putin wanting to people wanting to keep Putin in power. Now, there is a constitutional limit on power in Russia. You cannot be president more than 2 terms in a row. So the way they've dealt with this is Vladimir Putin and his best political ally, Dmitry Medvedev, have sometimes switched to being the prime minister and president. In the one election where Putin couldn't run as president, Medvedev was president and Putin was prime minister, and they switched back and forth in these roles. Now, this could very well be an authoritarian power switch, but it's also very democratically supported, even if you take away the fact there might be some political double dealings there. Putin and Medvedev are very powerful and supported within Russia. So Russia has a semi-presidential political system, much like France. Except in this case, the president has a lot more power than they do in France. So this could also be called a super-presidential system. Some people argue that it might be super-presidential as opposed to semi-presidential. And it really depends on where the power is held, which also kind of depends on where Putin is at the moment. So Russia has something called a Duma, which serves as their parliament, which has proportional representative elections every 5 years. The president himself is directly elected every 6 years, and the prime minister is appointed by the president. The Federal Council, which is their version of an upper house, represents the federal states within Russia, and it consists of 168 deputies. There is a separate judiciary in Russia, but this is appointed by the president. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the president can only serve 2 consecutive terms. Right, and this is where the tandem kicks in within Russia, right, where Medvedev and Putin switch positions. Now, some of these extra powers that the president has, he can dissolve parliament, he gets to appoint the prime minister, he has the ability to have decrees. So the president is very popular in Russia. And I'm going to show you an illustration of how this works. Right, so what you see here is a very good illustration of how Russia functions. And it looks very similar to what France has, except it's federal, right? So you get a federal council on top of things. So I'm just going to leave this here for a minute, and you can just take a look at it and see how this functions. It's very much like you would expect with the citizens voting for the president and citizens voting for a parliament. Right? It's very simple. So here are some conclusions we need to take away from Russia. Right, Russia is very, very fond of strong leaders. They have a very long history of strong people in power. Right, and generally the people in Russia don't know how to govern themselves. There's not been a long history of civil society. They're learning just now how to do rule of law. Right, the population's never really had a say up until the last 20 years or so in what their politics are going to be. So they usually follow the strongest leader. And in this case, it looks like Vladimir Putin might just be the best option, right? When you look at what all the other options are in Russia, Putin just might be the best option around. He's attempting to establish rule of law. He wants to build civil society. He wants to make Russia into a modern country. So maybe Putin is getting the support he gets because he is the strongest, best option in Russia. All right, y'all need to remember that you have papers due coming up, so you need to be reading your books. Right, the books, the fiction books that I've approved earlier this semester. You need to be reading your textbooks because this really helps build a lot of the information you need for the weeks. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And that's really it. So I hope you all have a good week, and I will see you next week when we talk about China.